The announcement came like a storm across international media outlets. NATO had formally declared Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso a threat. For an alliance that often reserves such language for nations engaged in global conflicts, the decision to place the young leader of a small West African country under such a label left the world stunned. Was this merely rhetoric, a warning meant to deter a rising African independence movement, or did it reflect a deeper shift in global geopolitics where Africa is no longer viewed as a subordinate continent, but as an emerging player with its own voice? The answer, as always, lies in history, economics, and the clash of worldviews now unfolding on the global stage. When Traoré rose to leadership in 2022, many doubted his capacity to endure the pressures that come with power. Yet, in a short time, he has become a symbol of defiance against Western dominance, rejecting the legacy of neo-colonial exploitation that had kept Burkina Faso and many African nations tethered to foreign interests. His message has been consistent. Africa must stand on its own, control its resources, and dictate its own destiny. But what began as an internal call for sovereignty has now drawn the ire of some of the most powerful organizations in the world. NATO, representing the collective defense and strategic interests of Western powers, is not accustomed to seeing a leader of a modestly sized African state command global attention, mobilize Pan-African solidarity, and refuse to bend to external pressure. The declaration of Traoré as a threat is not merely about Burkina Faso's political trajectory. It signals a fear among Western powers that the model he represents could spread across Africa and beyond. The concept of rejecting Western military presence, renegotiating natural resource contracts, and seeking new alliances outside the traditional Western sphere is profoundly destabilizing to the global order established after World War II. NATO was founded as a military alliance to counter external adversaries, primarily the Soviet Union, yet today it finds itself describing an African leader whose primary agenda is sovereignty, food security, and economic liberation as a global threat. Why, then, would NATO issue such a strong label? One reason is Burkina Faso's increasingly open partnerships with powers outside the Western Bloc. Traoré has courted closer ties with Russia, China, and other global South countries. These alliances are not strictly ideological but pragmatic, aimed at diversifying Burkina Faso's economic and security options. By expelling French troops and closing Western military bases, Traoré signaled that the days of automatic Western access to African soil were over. For NATO, which depends on strategic locations across the continent for counterterrorism, logistics, and global positioning, the loss of Burkina Faso represents more than a symbolic blow. It undermines a carefully built infrastructure of influence. Equally unsettling for the West is Traoré's insistence on resource sovereignty. Burkina Faso, though not as resource-rich as some of its neighbors, holds valuable reserves of gold and other minerals. For decades, these have been extracted under conditions that benefited foreign companies far more than local populations. By revisiting contracts, imposing taxes, and demanding local beneficiation, Traoré is setting a precedent that could ripple across Africa. If every African nation were to follow this model, Western corporations would lose billions in revenue streams, and governments dependent on those corporate taxes would face significant challenges. The ripple effect is not only economic, but deeply geopolitical. NATO's label must also be seen in the context of an ideological war. The West frames itself as the defender of democracy and human rights, while portraying leaders who reject its influence as authoritarian threats. Yet, in Burkina Faso, Traoré is celebrated by many as a liberator who speaks the language of ordinary citizens. His governance style, often described as austere and soldierly, resonates with a population tired of corruption, foreign dependency, and political stagnation. The West sees him as a destabilizer. His people see him as a restorer of dignity. It is this contrast of narratives that fuels global debate. When Traore responded to NATO's declaration, his words reverberated across Africa. Calm, firm, and unapologetic, he stated that Burkina Faso would not be intimidated by military alliances built on centuries of colonial domination. He reminded the world that Burkina Faso had the sovereign right to choose its partners and determine its own path. More importantly, he framed NATO's declaration not as a threat to him personally, but as a warning to all African nations. A leader who chooses independence can be labeled a danger. Then no African state is safe from external manipulation. His reply shook the West precisely because it touched on truths often left unspoken, that Africa's struggle for sovereignty is still ongoing, and that the real threat lies not in a young leader, but in a system that refuses to let go of control. Africa's response to NATO's declaration was swift and telling. Leaders across the continent, especially those aligned with Pan-Africanist visions, expressed solidarity with Traoré. For them, his treatment by NATO symbolized the broader disdain with which Western powers have often regarded African sovereignty. From Mali to Niger, from Guinea to South Africa, voices rose in support of Burkina Faso's right to chart its course. Civil society groups across Africa echoed the sentiment, viewing Traoré as not just a national leader but a continental figure in a new liberation struggle. This groundswell of support reflects a growing realization. Africa's unity may be forged not through treaties written in boardrooms, but through shared resistance to external pressure. Globally, reactions were mixed. In the West, analysts warned that Burkina Faso's trajectory could destabilize regional security, fueling terrorism and creating vacuums that adversarial powers like Russia might exploit. Yet, in much of the global South, Traoré was hailed as a leader of courage, someone daring to question the unspoken rules of international politics. His defiance has sparked debates in Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East about the role of Western institutions and whether the time has come for alternative alliances to take center. It is essential to understand that NATO's declaration does not necessarily mean military action against Burkina Faso. The alliance operates by consensus, and its members vary widely in their appetite for intervention. However, the rhetoric is significant. It signals that Traoré is now under close surveillance, his moves scrutinized, his alliances questioned. It also raises the stakes for Burkina Faso, a country already grappling with security challenges from extremist groups and economic vulnerabilities. Yet history shows that when external powers attempt to isolate a leader who embodies national pride, the effect can backfire, strengthening his legitimacy at home. In Burkina Faso's case, NATO's words may have galvanized rather than weakened Traoré's position. His government has framed the declaration as evidence of Western fear and desperation. By doing so, they have turned an external condemnation into internal validation, reinforcing the idea that the struggle is not just about Burkina Faso, but about Africa as a whole. The narrative of David versus Goliath, of a small nation defying an immense alliance, resonates deeply with populations weary of perceived global injustices. Looking ahead, the confrontation between Traoré and NATO encapsulates larger trends shaping our world. The decline of unquestioned Western dominance, the rise of multipolarity, and the assertion of global South voices are converging into a new reality. Africa, long viewed as a periphery in global affairs, is asserting itself as a center of gravity. Traoré, for better or worse, is at the forefront of this shift. His actions, his defiance, and his words are symbolic of a generation unwilling to inherit the chains of dependency. The implications are profound. If Burkina Faso can withstand the pressures now arrayed against it, it may inspire other African nations to follow suit, rethinking their reliance on Western institutions. If, however, Traore is undermined, it could send a chilling message to aspiring leaders across the continent. The battle, therefore, is not just about one man or one nation, but about the trajectory of an entire continent in a rapidly changing world order. In conclusion, NATO's declaration of Ibrahim Traoré as a threat reveals more about the anxieties of the West than about the intentions of Burkina Faso. It is a reflection of a world in transition where new voices are rising and old powers are scrambling to maintain their grip. Traoré's reply, unapologetic and firm, has shaken the West because it reflects a truth that cannot be easily dismissed. Africa is awakening, and no alliance, however powerful, can silence a continent determined to reclaim its destiny.